Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. Today I want to tell you guys about France's secret empire in the world. I'm sure many of you have heard about famous Frenchmen such as Napoleon Bonaparte and about France's historic empire in Europe and abroad. It's mostly thought that this country left its remaining colonies in the mid-20th century, but what if I told you that this empire is to this day alive and well? Maybe not on paper, but still works the same, just under new terms. The countries I'm specifically going to talk about are in West Africa and overseas, which is where modern French colonialism is mostly concentrated in. Africa's the richest continent on the planet, with a plethora of natural resources with some of the most amazing flora and fauna in the world. Unfortunately for the peoples of Africa, this was both a blessing and a curse at the same time. Europeans like the Portuguese have had a presence in Africa for a while, dating back to times of Columbus. But it wasn't until the 1800s when Europe got thirsty for those sweet natural resources they've always sought to replace depleting ones back home. France was one of the biggest powers taking over most of Western Africa. After centuries of wars and exploitation, France promised to leave the continent for good after World War II, as did most other European countries. Now France is more discreet in its control over African resources and governments. By using the corruption in many of these countries' governments, France essentially bribed state officials using their firms and companies into being their lapdogs, thus giving them control of entire nations' resources. Sadly, this becomes a norm where Africans work to extract their own resources in exchange for crumbs from the shares their governments and the companies that are based in France get. As if that wasn't enough, France went the extra mile to give them their old currency, the franc, now known as CFA franc, as a way to also control their economies. That way, they get to take Africa's resources while at the same time have their money in their central bank. I'm sure you can tell that this did not sat well with many people, and you're right, because just last year, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger all agreed to leave ECOWAS, which is an economic union between West African states because of its foreign influence, mainly subsiding from, you guessed it, France. By doing this, they have kicked out the French military, which claims it was stationed in the region to, quote-unquote, prevent terrorism and preserve the peace, which we all know that they're really just trying to protect their own interests in those countries with complete disregard for the people living there. If France really cared, terrorism wouldn't have increased in those countries during their military presence. So not only do French companies control most of the mining and industry, but have direct control over their economy and military. It's crazy to think that while France is doing all of this in their quote-unquote former colonies, French people have the nerve to be racist towards African immigrants. Of course, this isn't all French people, but we've all seen those massive protests going on in France and in Europe abroad against immigration, particularly from Africa and the Middle East, which is pretty ironic, wouldn't you say? How are you going to loot an entire continent's resources, then get mad when they immigrate to your country? Especially when you teach them that your language and culture is superior to all others. This doesn't just apply to France, to other countries as well, such as the UK, which is another massive player, but more discreet. One most people forget about is Italy, which, believe it or not, still meddles in Africa. An example of this is during Somalia's civil war, Italy illegally dumped toxic nuclear waste into its waters, and has not faced any formal backlash from any country. That's on top of the colonialist history they already had in Somalia and East Africa as a whole. At the very least, President Giorgia Meloni acknowledges Europe's meddling in Africa as a result of the current situation, instead of just blindly pointing the finger at immigrants despite that making up most of her campaigning prior. The same cannot be said, however, with Macron, who still believes in that Africa is getting something of value in return for all of this looting. Sorry, Macron, but looting countries for centuries and forcing them to learn your language isn't going to make them want to embrace it once you're done. Overall, this situation is still pretty dire, but as seen with Burkina Faso and the others, there is still hope that this new under-the-table form of colonialism, imperialism will crumble, and Africa can finally achieve its true independence. As someone with African heritage, I found this to be a very important topic to discuss, and I hope that I enlightened you guys on what's going on. Thanks for watching till the end. Goodbye.